Hi guys, and welcome to Calm Night Radio Channel. Tonight we step onto a shoreline where the world still feels unfinished, where damp wind moves through reeds and pine, and where a human life can be weighed as casually as a sack of grain. You can almost hear the creak of timber at the water's edge, the slap of dark waves against a small boat, the mutter of settlers who believe they are building a new society while carrying old brutal habits with them. What does it feel like to arrive in a place that calls itself new, yet already knows how to be cruel, and how? In the year 1630 does a person make a life inside a system that has not fully written its rules, but has already learned how to trap people inside them. So, before you settle into the story, take a moment to like the video and subscribe. And while you are here, comment your location and local time now. Dim the lights, and you step into an English colony where the air smells of mud, wood smoke, river salt, and sweat. You're not entering a neat world of fixed labels. That comes later. In 1630, the English colonies in North America are still unstable. Damp, hungry places. The settlements along the Chesapeake feel raw and improvised, as if they have been nailed together in a hurry and left to argue with the weather. Houses lean. Fences sag, boots sink into soft ground. Tobacco fields spread wider each season, because tobacco is the plant that whispers promises into every planter's ear. It promises wealth, status, and one more year of survival. It also demands labour with the appetite of a monster, so you begin with the land itself. The mornings can feel cold and silver, with mist lying low over the river. By afternoon, the heat settles on your shoulders like wet cloth. Mosquitoes rise from the marsh. Smoke from cooking fires drifts through the settlement and clings to your hair and skin. The whole place smells like damp earth, livestock, fish, sour beer, and human effort. Nothing is clean for long. Not the tools, not the clothes, not the hands. Into this harsh landscape come Africans. Some taken through violence, some sold through systems shaped by war and trade, all forced into a colonial economy that sees labour before personhood. English records from the early 17th century do not always describe black people in clear legal terms. That uncertainty matters. Historians still argue over how many Africans in these earliest decades were treated under terms closer to indentured servitude, and how many were already living in conditions that were slavery in all but name. But for the people enduring it, the paperwork matters less than the reality. You can call it ambiguity if you're standing at a desk. It feels different when you are the one being controlled. You notice quickly that survival here is never guaranteed. Disease moves through the colonies with unnerving ease. Fever, dysentery, and hunger visit like rude relatives who refuse to leave. Early Virginia is notorious for its death rate. Many English servants do not survive their contracts. That grim fact sometimes fools people into imagining a rough equality of suffering. But suffering is not the same as powerlessness. A white servant may be beaten, exploited, and overworked, yet still remain within the circle of people the law is more likely to recognize as fully human. A black person, even in these early years, stands in a far more dangerous space, one where status can slide toward permanence, and where skin colour is already beginning to shape destiny. You walk through a yard packed with barrels, rough planks, and drying leaves of tobacco. Men move with a tired heaviness. Women haul, stir, scrub, carry, and mend. Children watch everything. An overseer shouts, a dog barks. Somewhere an axe hits wood in a steady rhythm. The sounds never quite stop. Even in quiet moments, you hear the buzz of flies and the distant wash of water against the bank. Labour fills every corner of the day. For black Americans in 1630, daily life depends partly on where you are and who claims control over you. Some live on small farms, some in larger tobacco operations, some in households where domestic work and field work blur together. The word household sounds cosy, but colonial households are often centres of command, discipline, and fear. A kitchen can smell of boiled corn, salted meat, and ash, yet still feel colder than the weather. A workyard may be open to the sky, but never free. You wake early, usually too early. Before sunrise, the colony has a special kind of darkness, one mixed with fog and the last glow of embers. Your fingers feel stiff in the chill, clothing rubs against the skin, coarse and uneven, linen can scratch, wool can itch. Shoes, if you have them, may pinch or leak. You carry water that numbs your hands, or you head to the fields where dew soaks the hems of your garments. By midday, that same outfit can feel hot, heavy, and stiff with sweat. Food is simple and often disappointing. Cornmeal, peas, salted fish, maybe pork, maybe not enough of it, maybe spoiled. You taste smoke in almost everything because the air itself seems seasoned with it. Bread can be dense, stew can be thin. Fresh fruit appears when the season allows, and then disappears again. One quirky detail from the period is that some colonists, with all the confidence of people who should absolutely not be trusted in a kitchen, try to make unfamiliar New World foods behave like beloved English ones. The results were often gloomy. You can picture someone squinting at maize as if stubbornness alone might turn it into wheat. For Africans in the colony, food also becomes a place where memory and adaptation meet. Familiar ingredients from home are scarce or absent. Cooking methods must shift. Tastes must adjust. Yet people carry knowledge with them. How to pound grain, how to season a pot, how to stretch little into enough. Cultural survival is not always dramatic. Sometimes it is the simple refusal to forget what nourishment is supposed to mean. The social world around you is tightly watched, but not fully settled. In 1630, the English colonies have not yet produced the complete legal code that will later define hereditary racial slavery with brutal precision. That process is forming, slowly, and then not so slowly. In this moment, some Africans gain freedom after years of service, and a few manage to acquire land, marry, or enter court records as property holders themselves. Those cases are real, and they matter because they reveal that the system is still under construction. But they are not comforting. They're exceptions inside a tightening vice, not proof of a fair world. The colony is experimenting, and the experiment keeps discovering that cruelty is profitable. Religion hovers over everything. Church attendance matters. Baptism matters, though not always in the ways people hope. Some Europeans claim Christian identity should shape treatment, while others quietly decide profit matters more than theology. There is uncertainty here too. Some scholars note that, in the early decades, conversion did not yet carry the same fixed legal consequences it later would. Others debate how much room there ever was for genuine spiritual inclusion. Either way, you can see the contradiction plainly. Settlers speak of salvation while buying and selling labour under threat. You notice faces. That is important. History often flattens people into numbers, ships, laws, and crops. But daily life is lived in glances, postures, and tones of voice. A black man pauses before answering a question, measuring risk in a heartbeat. A woman keeps her expression controlled while listening to an order she has heard too many times. A child learns quickly when to stay silent. These are survival skills. They grow in the body. At night, the colony changes but does not soften much. Darkness covers the rough edges of buildings and turns the river black. The smell of marsh water rises stronger after sunset. Frogs call from the reeds. Insects rasp in the grass. The day's heat leaks slowly from the ground. If you lie down on a pallet of straw or on boards, or in a cramped corner shared with others, your muscles keep the memory of labour. The back aches. The shoulders throb. Smoke lingers in the lungs. Sleep comes in scraps. And still, people talk. Quietly. Very quietly. Language in 1630 is a world of crossings. Africans arriving in English colonies may speak a wide range of languages, depending on where they were captured or sold. Communication can be fragmented. improvised, inventive. Some learn English words quickly because they must. Some rely on gestures, borrowed terms, repeated sounds, or help from others who have spent longer in the Atlantic world. Out of these pressures, new forms of speech begin to grow, not polished, not official, just necessary. You can hear it in the pauses, the substitutions, the careful listening. Even silence carries meaning. One of the more surprising realities of early colonial life is how mixed and unstable the labouring population can be. In one small area, you might find English indentured servants, Africans under varying conditions of coercion, sailors passing through, native people navigating trade and danger, and masters obsessed with productivity. It is not a tidy ladder. It is a crowded and suspicious human arrangement. Alliances happen. So do betrayals. Shared labour does not erase unequal vulnerability. Now and then, the records offer a strange little flash of personality. A court note, a complaint, a baptism, a punishment, a marriage. The archives do not breathe easily, but sometimes they exhale. From these fragments, you sense that black life in early America is not only a story of imposed labour, it is also a story of adaptation, observation, wit, and guarded hope. A person can laugh in a hard world. A person can notice beauty without forgiving the place. There is beauty, awkwardly enough. Dawn on the river can be lovely. Pine resin warms in the sun and releases a sharp, clean scent. Birds move over the water in patterns that nobody owns. Summer evenings glow softly over the fields. The problem, of course, is that beauty does not cancel injustice. A pink sky can hang over a very ugly society. Colonial America is good at that combination. You also begin to understand how much is being invented in front of you. Race as a rigid colonial system is not appearing all at once, fully formed, with trumpets and official banners. It is being assembled through habits, bargains, fears, and profitable decisions. A planter wants labour that does not end. A court treats one body differently from another. A child inherits status. A rumour becomes practice. A practice becomes law. In 1630 you stand close enough to feel the machinery before all its panels are in place. That uncertainty creates a specific emotional climate. It is not hopeful exactly, but unstable. For black people, the colony offers narrow and inconsistent openings, surrounded by much larger threats. You may see one person negotiate better terms, gain release, or carve out a foothold, while another is pushed deeper into bondage. The difference may depend on location, owner, timing, or sheer accident. Such unpredictability is its own form of control. When rules shift, power belongs to those who can bend them. So what is life really like for black Americans in 1630s? It is exhausting. It is watched. It is uncertain. It is full of labour, discomfort, and risk, but not empty of thought or feeling. You move through a world that tries to name you as function before person, and yet personhood remains stubborn. You smell river mud and wood smoke. You hear commands, tools, coughing, prayer, laughter that stays low, and the lonely call of birds over the water. You feel rough cloth, splintered wood, damp morning air, and fatigue pressing into the bones. Around you, a colonial society is teaching itself how to become more cruel, more organised, and more racial in its cruelty. And in the middle of that unfinished process, black life does not wait for legal definitions to become fully settled. It is already being lived, in hunger and work, in whispers and memory, in caution and endurance, in the quiet insistence that even here, even now, a human being is more than the role forced upon them. You begin at the water, because the water is where so many lives are broken into pieces small enough to be counted. A port in the early 17th century is never still. The tide lifts boats and drops them again. Ropes groan. Gulls complain overhead with the confidence of unpaid supervisors. Men shout over barrels, casks, baskets, timber, and bundles of cloth. The air tastes of salt, tar, fish, sweat, and old wood. Every surface seems sticky with humidity or grime. A harbour looks busy, practical, ordinary. That is part of its horror. It can make the movement of human beings seem as routine as the movement of sugar or tobacco. For black Americans in 1630, the story often begins long before any English colony comes into view. It may begin in West Central Africa, in Senegambia, in the Bight of Benin, or in other regions tied into expanding Atlantic trade. The circumstances differ, and that difference matters. Some people are captured in war. Some are seized in raids. Some are condemned through local political struggles, debts, or judicial punishments shaped by both African and European pressures. Historians continue to dispute the exact balance between internal African systems of enslavement and the growing outside demand that made those systems harsher and more profitable. What is clear is that European traders do not simply drift into an existing market like innocent customers at a village fair. They help transform the scale, direction, and violence of human sail. You can feel that transformation in the atmosphere of the coast. Forts and trading posts stand as awkward, grim meeting places between worlds. Languages overlap. Goods are inspected. Firearms, metal tools, cloth, alcohol, and luxury items circulate beside human captives. There is bargaining, delay, rumour, and calculation. A person may wait in a barracoon or holding space for days or weeks, surrounded by strangers whose grief sounds different but means the same thing. The smell is close and sour. Fear has a physical presence. It clings to the skin like heat. Then comes the ship. It is worse than the dock. A slave ship is designed to solve a monstrous commercial problem. How do you pack the greatest number of captive people into a floating wooden structure and still deliver enough of them alive to turn a profit? The answer is as ugly as you would expect. The spaces below deck are low, dark, crowded, and foul. Bodies are arranged with almost mathematical indifference. The ship moves, creaks, pitches, and leaks. Vomit mixes with seawater, waste collects, illness spreads. Air becomes something you have to fight for. The mainstream fact is plain enough. The Middle Passage is one of the central horrors of Atlantic history, and mortality is high. Yet even that blunt statement does not fully capture the texture of the experience. It is not just danger, it is confinement that seems to erase the ordinary rules of being human. You cannot move when you want. You cannot eat when you want. You cannot turn away from another person's pain because there is nowhere else to look. The smell alone would be unforgettable. Salt, sickness, blood, waste, wet rope, stale grain, unwashed wood, panic. A whole ship steeped in suffering. Some captives resist in every way they can. Refusal to eat becomes one form. So does mutiny, sabotage, or jumping overboard when the chance appears. Ship crews know this. They are armed against desperation. Nets may be hung to stop people from throwing themselves into the sea. Instruments are used to force mouths open for feeding. Discipline is constant because the traders know something obvious that their records rarely say with honesty. Everyone on board understands this is violence. Nobody mistakes it for a simple labour arrangement. A quirky and chilling tidbit from the maritime world is the strange coexistence of terror and bureaucracy. A captain may record weather, cargo quality, and repairs in the same matter-of-fact tone used to note disease or death among captives. You can almost hear the scratch of a pen as a man calculates loss while the ship groans around him. Human misery is folded into bookkeeping. There is something uniquely cold about that. A storm at sea and a child's death can occupy neighbouring lines of the same page. When land finally appears, relief does not mean safety. It means sail. Ports in the Atlantic world vary in size and style, but certain patterns repeat. Captives are unloaded, examined, sorted, washed, or rubbed with oil to improve appearance. Teeth may be checked, limbs inspected, skin observed for signs of illness or strength. Buyers look at people the way horse traders look at animals, except with even more self-congratulation. It is one of history's less charming habits that people often perform cruelty with an air of practical seriousness, as though being organised makes them decent. The sale itself can happen through auction, private bargain, or transfer between merchants and planters. Terms depend on the colony, the moment, the ship, and the buyer's confidence. In some early English colonies, especially before later legal systems become rigidly codified, captives may enter records under labels that look inconsistent or incomplete. A person might be listed by first name alone, by a description of origin, by a generic category such as Negro, or by not much at all. That vagueness is not harmless. It shows how the colonial archive reduces identity. If the system cannot be bothered to know who you are, it becomes easier for it to decide what may be done to you. For some Africans reaching English North America around 1630, arrival does not always mean direct transport from Africa to the colony in one clean line. The Atlantic world is messier than that. People are moved through Spanish, Portuguese, Dutch, or English networks. A person may be sold more than once before reaching an English settlement. Some come through the Caribbean, where plantation systems are already sharpening techniques of labour control. Others are carried by privateers or traders operating in murkier legal waters, because the 17th century has a real talent for turning theft into commerce, and commerce into policy. This matters because arrival in an English colony can be the final stage of a much longer uprooting. By then, names may have been altered, kin may have vanished from sight, language ties may be frayed, religious practices may be hidden or interrupted. The crossing is not only geographic, it is social and emotional. You are forced into a place where people speak of you as labour, value, stock, hands. Notice that word, hands. Colonial societies love that word. It is a neat little trick. Remove the face, the voice, the mother, the memory, and keep only the part that can harvest tobacco. Still, even under these conditions, people observe and adapt. That does not make the system less brutal. It reveals human persistence. Captives learn the rhythms of ships, the habits of sailors, the moods of markets, the sounds of commands in unfamiliar tongues. They notice who can be approached, who should be feared, which gestures signal danger, which scraps of information might matter later. Survival often begins with attention. You stand in a colonial port and watch the moment when trade becomes daily life. A buyer takes possession, a small boat pushes inland through marsh channels, or a cart jolts along a rough path lined with pine and scrub. The sky is wide, but the choices are not. The person being transported inland may know almost nothing about the destination, only that it is not home, only that the air smells different, only that the birds make unfamiliar sounds, only that the language around them has sharp edges and hurried tones. Some early arrivals enter households where labour is mixed. They may work fields, clear land, tend animals, carry water, cook, wash, mend, or assist in tobacco processing. Others end up in larger operations with harsher gang labour. The exact assignment can seem almost random from the captive's point of view, yet each choice serves colonial need. Tobacco is hungry for workers, settlers are hungry for status, merchants are hungry for returns. It is astonishing how many grand historical systems, once stripped of their fancy language, turn out to be powered by somebody wanting more than they need. There is also the shock of unfamiliar environments. For Africans brought from tropical or subtropical regions, the Chesapeake can feel strange in season and texture. Winters bite, mud clings. Spring brings insects in swarms. Summers can be thick and punishing. Forests crowd the horizon differently than savanna or old farming landscapes. Rivers are broad and brown. The smell of pine resin, marsh grass, and cured tobacco settles into daily experience. A person must learn the landscape while grieving the loss of another one. Scholars still debate how much continuity of African ethnic identity remained possible in these earliest English colonial settings, where numbers of Africans were smaller than they later became, and where people from different regions were mixed together. Some argue that fragmentation was swift and severe. Others point to the stubborn survival of naming patterns, agricultural knowledge, music, foodways, spiritual practices, and social habits. Both views contain truth. Severe disruption is real. So is cultural endurance. A person can lose almost everything and still carry a way of moving through the world. One detail often missed in simplified stories is that many captives arrive with practical expertise the colonists badly need. They know farming, herding, fishing, ironwork, boat handling, carpentry, or medicine. English settlers do not always understand this at first, partly because racism is already making them foolish, but colonies are improvising places. Skill matters. A black worker who knows how to cultivate difficult ground, preserve food, handle livestock, or read weather signs may be quietly indispensable even while denied dignity. This is one of slavery's ugliest paradoxes. The system depends heavily on the intelligence of the people it tries to degrade. And then there is naming. Colonial records often assign Christian names or simplified labels, treating African names as inconvenient sounds to be replaced. A new name can be imposed by a buyer, a clerk, or a household. Sometimes the old name survives privately. Sometimes it vanishes from the written record, but not from memory. Imagine hearing yourself called by a new word in a new voice, and understanding that the change is not a gift. It is an attempt at possession. The emotional weather of all this is difficult to overstate. Grief is present, but grief cannot be your only occupation. Hunger intrudes, fatigue intrudes, commands intrude. You may ache for parents, spouse, siblings, children, homeland, or language. Yet the day insists on practical tasks. Carry that, lift this, walk there, answer quickly. Labour becomes the structure into which loss is forced. Night can be its own strange country. In an unfamiliar sleeping place, every sound is too clear. Timber pops softly as it cools. Someone coughs nearby. A dog shifts outside. Wind presses against rough boards. The smell of damp earth rises through cracks. You lie still and listen to breathing in the dark, and perhaps for a moment the darkness feels like the only thing not owned by anyone. That is how crossing becomes settlement, not by healing, by force. So when you ask what life was really like in these early days, you have to begin with this journey through trade, confinement, and sale. The route to black life in English America is not a simple arrival story. It is a process of tearing away. A person is separated from place, kin, language, and control, then inserted into a colonial world eager to profit from that dislocation. The ship is not merely transport. The market is not merely exchange. They are machines for remaking human lives under coercion. And yet the people carried through these machines do not become blank pages. They arrive with memory, skill, fear, observation, and will. They are pushed into a system that would prefer silence. But silence is never the whole story. In the hold, on the deck, at the dock, in the yard of sail, on the path inland, human thought continues. Human feeling continues. Human dignity is attacked, but not erased. The traders never manage that final part, however hard they try. Their ledgers are too small for what survives inside a person. You enter Virginia at ground level, which is the least flattering angle for any colony trying to look impressive. The place is muddy, hungry, damp, and determined to call itself prosperous anyway. Tobacco has begun to work its strange magic on English minds. Men who can barely keep their roofs from leaking still speak grandly about acreage, shipments, and future fortune. You smell wet clay, trampled grass, wood smoke, river water, and the sharp green bitterness of tobacco leaves drying nearby. Nothing here feels settled in the comfortable sense. It feels settled in the uneasy sense, as if people have planted themselves in a landscape that is still deciding whether to tolerate them. For black Americans living in Virginia around 1630, this is the setting in which daily reality takes shape. The colony is not yet the giant slave society it will later become, but the ingredients are already on the table. Tobacco prices and labour needs are reshaping everything. Land is being claimed and cleared. Households are trying to become plantations, or at least trying to sound like plantations when speaking to their neighbours. Every ambitious planter wants more workers. Every season of growth encourages a wider appetite. The soil, once opened, seems to demand people. The work begins with land itself. Before a field can produce tobacco, it must be cut, burned, stumped, hoed, and watched. Trees fall with heavy crashes, branches are dragged aside. Smoke from burning brush settles low and stings the eyes. Ash clings to boots and hems. The smell is powerful, a mix of sap, char, and raw earth. The landscape feels wounded and unfinished. That is often how colonial progress looks up close. A great deal of sweat, a great deal of boasting, and a terrible talent for calling destruction improvement. You move through a tobacco holding and see how much attention the crop demands. Tobacco is not a plant you toss casually into the ground and revisit when convenient. It requires seed beds, transplanting, weeding, worming, topping, cutting, curing, sorting, and packing. It asks for constant hands. Even in a small operation, that means long days of repetitive labour. In a larger one, it means the whole rhythm of life bends around the leaf. A planter may talk about freedom and enterprise. The field tells a more honest story. This wealth is slow, sticky, exhausting work. For black workers, Virginia's labour system in 1630 can still look inconsistent on paper, but less so in practice. Some Africans are recorded in ways that resemble indentured servants, while others are treated with harsher permanence that points clearly towards slavery. Historians continue to debate how flexible or fixed status really was during these early decades. Colonial records are uneven, and courts do not always speak with one voice. Yet ambiguity in the archive does not mean comfort in life. A person can live under uncertainty that always tilts in someone else's favour. That is one of the colony's quieter skills. The people around you notice difference constantly. Skin colour is observed, origin is observed, religion is observed, speech is observed. Virginia society is already building habits of racial distinction, even before later laws harden them more completely. White servants may suffer brutal treatment, but they are not being pushed into exactly the same future. A black worker stands in a more fragile legal position, one where freedom may be difficult to claim, easy to deny, and always vulnerable to local power. The colony may not have written every cruel rule yet, but it has begun thinking in that direction with real enthusiasm. A day in Virginia starts early because everything in agriculture starts earlier than civilized people would ever choose. Before sunrise, the air can feel damp enough to wear. Mist lingers over the low ground. The chill catches in your fingers. You step outside and smell wet leaves, smoke from last night's fire, and the faint sourness of animals nearby. Somewhere a rooster complains. Somewhere water laps against a muddy bank. Then the tasks begin. Carry tools, clear rows, tend seedlings, cut wood, fetch water, lift barrels, feed animals, repair fences, strip leaves, tie bundles. The work changes, but it never exactly stops. The houses are rough, especially outside the better households. Some are timber framed with wattle and daub. Some are plank structures with gaps that let in wind, damp, and curious insects with no sense of personal boundaries. Roofs can leak, Floors may be packed earth or rough boards. Smoke hangs indoors because fireplaces are necessary and chimneys are imperfect. The smell inside is usually a blend of ash, stale food, damp cloth, sweat, and whatever storage items happen to share the space. Comfort exists, but it is rare and highly selective. You notice quickly that illness shapes the colony almost as much as labour does. Fever can strike with little warning. Bad water, spoiled food, and crowded living conditions help sickness travel. Malaria, dysentery, and other diseases haunt early Virginia, especially in low-lying areas. A planter might dream of steady output, but a disease season can tear through those plans with rude efficiency. This is a mainstream truth of the Chesapeake. Death is common enough to feel woven into the place. Graves do not always receive much ceremony. The colony is busy surviving, and survival can become alarmingly practical. That shared vulnerability to disease should not be mistaken for shared standing. Black workers suffer not only from the same harsh environment, but from weaker protection, harsher discipline, and more precarious recognition. When a person with power falls ill, others respond with concern, expense, and prayer. When a labourer falls ill, the question may be whether recovery is likely enough to justify care. Human value is calculated differently. You can feel it in the speed of footsteps, the tone of orders, the willingness to pause work. Even compassion, when it appears, often arrives mixed with self-interest. One odd little feature of Virginia life is how proudly many colonists describe scarcity, while still trying to outdo one another in status. A man may dine badly, sleep poorly, and own 3 useful spoons, but if he has tobacco, a few workers, and a sense of theatre, he carries himself like a miniature emperor of the marsh. Colonial vanity is remarkably durable. It survives mud, mosquitoes, and embarrassing architecture. For Black Americans, that vanity often becomes another burden, because status-hungry planters want visible control. Ownership is not only economic, it is performative. A master wants others to see command in action, so discipline becomes a daily language. Orders are given sharply, time is monitored, work is inspected, disobedience draws punishment. The exact forms vary by household and location, but the atmosphere is unmistakable. You learn to read mood before words. Is the overseer irritated, drunk, tired, eager to impress, nervous about crop quality, worried about market prices? These details matter because a worker's safety can depend on them. In societies built on coercion, emotional weather becomes practical knowledge. At the same time, Virginia is not silent. Labouring people speak while they can, though often in lowered voices and guarded phrases. English servants grumble. African workers exchange fragments of thought, instruction, memory, and warning. Native communities nearby remain powerful presences in the region, and the colony lives in constant tension with them through trade, diplomacy, and violence. Virginia is not a sealed English world. It is a contested landscape where many peoples are forced into contact under unequal conditions. That makes daily life more complex than the neat textbook categories suggest. Food in Virginia depends on season, status, luck, and storage. Corn appears in many diets because it is practical, even if some colonists complain about it with the stubborn sorrow of people who miss English bread. Salted meat is common when available, though it can be tough, briny, and repetitive enough to make any dinner feel like a punishment with table manners. Fish, beans, peas, garden produce, and stews round out meals when circumstances allow. For labourers, quantity matters as much as quality. Hunger narrows the imagination. A warm bowl of anything becomes important. Black people in Virginia also bring knowledge that the colony needs more than it admits. Agricultural skill is one part of that. So is practical medicine. Knowledge of herbs, treatment methods, food preparation, animal care, and environmental signs can shape survival in a place where settlers often pretend confidence while misunderstanding their surroundings. Some remedies travel quietly from person to person: a poultice, a boiled root, a way to ease fever or soothe pain. Colonial records do not always honour the source of such knowledge, but daily life remembers use even when history forgets credit. Scholars differ on how quickly African cultural continuities took root in early Virginia's relatively small black population. Some emphasize dispersal and isolation. Others stress how even scattered individuals could preserve gestures, rhythms, names, beliefs, and techniques. The uncertainty is genuine. The archive is thin, and much of what mattered most was never written down by those in power. Still, you can sense continuity in ordinary acts. How a person prepares food, how they braid hair, how they mark a loss, how they hum while working. Culture does not need permission to persist. Children in Virginia absorb the colony's values with alarming speed. They watch adults command and obey. They learn who may speak freely and who must measure every word. They notice whose pain matters and whose does not. In some households, black and white children may occupy the same physical spaces for a time, but they are not being trained for the same future. That distinction grows more important with each passing year. A colony teaches itself hierarchy by teaching it to the young. Once children learn to see domination as normal, the system starts reproducing itself with unnerving efficiency. Nature offers moments of beauty that do not ask anyone's approval. Like glints on the James River, frogs call from wet ground after dusk. Pines hold the late sun with a kind of patient dignity. In spring, the scent of fresh growth can drift through a clearing and briefly soften the harshness of labour. But beauty here is unreliable company. It does not intervene. The sunset does not shorten the workday. The breeze does not untie a binding rule. Virginia can be beautiful and merciless in the same hour. At night, exhaustion settles deeply. Muscles twitch after long labour. Hands stay sore. Smoke clings to skin and hair. The body learns fatigue so thoroughly it begins carrying it like a second posture. You lie down in a cramped corner on rough boards, straw, or whatever the household permits, and listen to the colony at rest. A distant cough, the shift of someone turning over nearby, insects outside, wind moving through chinks in the wall. Sleep may come, but often with caution. Tomorrow is already waiting. So what is Virginia really offering black Americans in 1630? Not stability, not legal clarity, certainly not justice. It offers hard labour in a colony where profit is rising faster than moral restraint. It offers a social world in which race is becoming more important, even before the law has fully arranged its categories. It offers danger from disease, weather, punishment, and whim. Yet within that world, black people still think, work, adapt, grieve, observe, and endure with immense skill. Virginia wants their labour first and their humanity rarely. The tragedy is that the colony grows stronger because of them even while refusing to meet them as equals. That contradiction sits at the heart of its early success, like rot inside a handsome beam. You wake before the sky fully decides to brighten, because labour in a colonial world is rude like that. The air is cool and damp with a faint smell of wet soil, smoke, and animal pens. Somewhere nearby, a bucket knocks against wood, a rooster calls once, then again, as if personally offended by silence. You sit up with stiffness already waiting in your shoulders. The day has not begun, and yet your body feels as though it remembers all of yesterday in painful detail. That is the first truth of labour in 1630. Work does not only fill the hours, it settles into bone, breath, and sleep. For black Americans in these early English colonies, daily labour is not one thing. It shifts by season, by location, by the size of the holding, and by the needs of the people in charge. A person may spend one part of the day in a field and another in a yard, 1 week tending tobacco and the next hauling timber, washing linen, cooking food, or carrying water heavy enough to leave the arms trembling. Colonial labour is famously unromantic. Nobody here is strolling through golden light with a neat basket and a carefree song. This is sweat, repetition, instruction, correction, and fatigue dressed in rough cloth. In tobacco country, the crop governs the body. Seed beds must be prepared carefully. Young plants are set out by hand. Weeds are pulled. Worms are picked away. Leaves are topped, cut, and hung to cure. The work requires patience and endurance, which is an inconvenient combination when the weather is hot. The hours are long, and the people giving orders are not offering philosophical support. Tobacco leaves feel thick and slightly sticky. Their smell is green at first, then sharper and heavier as they dry. The curing houses carry a warm, bitter scent that settles in the throat. Fieldwork is only one part of the picture. Many black labourers in 1630 spend much of their time in domestic service or mixed household labour. The word domestic sounds gentler than the work itself. It means rising early to light fires, clean pots, grind grain, stir boiling food, wash clothes in cold water, scrub floors, mend garments, carry chamber pots, and serve people who often regard all this effort as the natural background music of their own comfort. Kitchens are hot, smoky, and crowded with demands. Laundry is punishing on the hands. Floors are rough. Water must be fetched, heated, hauled, and used with care. Even simple tasks arrive in long chains. You notice the soundscape of work before long. Axes bite into wood with a steady rhythm. Hoes scrape dry soil. Cattle snort and stamp. A pot lid rattles as steam escapes. Someone calls for more water. Someone else is told to move faster. The colony has very few quiet occupations. Even sewing comes with the crackle of hearth fire, the murmur of voices, the shuffle of feet on boards, the occasional cry of a child. Labour fills the ears as completely as it fills the day. Touch matters too. You feel rough handles against the palms, damp linen between the fingers, hot iron near the fire, splinters in wood, the bite of rope, the ache of repeated bending. Hands tell the story of work faster than words can. Nails crack, knuckles chafe, skin thickens. Back and shoulders carry a constant low burn. A person learns to move carefully not because the work is elegant, but because injury can make life even harder. In a world with little margin for rest, a cut hand or strained leg is not a minor inconvenience. It is a threat. Meals do not break the day so much as interrupt it briefly. Morning food may be plain and hurried. Cornmeal, porridge, a little bread if flour is available. Salted meat when fortune is smiling, which is not a daily habit. Midday food is often practical rather than satisfying. You eat for strength because work is waiting. The smell of stew or boiled grain may offer a little comfort, but the comfort rarely lasts long. Hunger returns quickly when labour burns through everything. A mainstream fact of early colonial labour is that the workday is long by modern standards and shaped heavily by daylight. Yet that simple statement can hide the emotional reality. It is not just a long day. It is a day in which your time is not truly yours. Even brief pauses can feel borrowed. Someone else decides what counts as enough. Someone else measures your effort. Someone else claims the result. For black workers, that loss of control is especially severe because labour is tied not merely to obligation but to coercion and social vulnerability. The body becomes something managed by others. In smaller households, roles can be frustratingly elastic. A labourer may be told to chop wood, then repair a fence, then help skin a slaughtered animal, then carry water, then assist with curing leaves, then return to the kitchen. There is no neat specialisation because the colony is too improvised for that. Everything needs doing, and those with the least power are expected to do most of it. This constant shifting can be exhausting in its own way. You do not merely repeat a task, you stay ready to be redirected at any moment. Children often work too, not always in the same ways as adults, but enough to learn fatigue early. They fetch water, gather kindling, watch younger children, scare birds from crops, run errands, and absorb the rhythms of command. Childhood in the early colony is short on leisure even for many white children. For black children, it is also shadowed by the colony's growing racial order. They learn quickly that labour is expected and that freedom of movement, speech, and future is not distributed evenly. A child notices these things with painful accuracy. There are also skilled tasks hidden inside the larger blur of labour. Some black workers handle livestock with practiced calm. Some become trusted in gardens, smokehouses, or storehouses. Some work as carpenters, coopers, boatmen, or smiths, depending on need and opportunity. Skill can bring a measure of value in the eyes of owners, though not necessarily greater security. In fact, being useful can simply mean more responsibility attached to the same lack of freedom. Colonial society has a genius for exploiting talent without honouring the person who carries it. One odd and slightly grim detail of the period is how often people complained about labour while depending completely on it. Planters wrote and spoke as if work itself were a troublesome inconvenience, unfairly imposed upon them by crops, weather, and markets, which is impressive considering that much of the actual labour was being done by others. Colonial self-pity can be remarkably sturdy. A man may own the field, the tools, and the workers, and still speak as if he is the true victim because tobacco worms have appeared at the wrong moment. The pace of work changes with the seasons. Spring brings planting and repair. Summer intensifies everything. Heat presses down, insects gather, and tasks stretch on under a sun that seems determined to inspect every mistake personally. Sweat runs into the eyes. Clothes cling. The smell of earth, plants, animals, and human effort thickens in the air. Autumn means harvesting, curing, storage, and preparation for colder months. Winter shifts the work indoors more often, but never into ease. Firewood must be cut, clothing mended, tools repaired, food preserved, animals tended. The labour does not vanish. It simply changes its coat. Historians still disagree on the precise balance between task labour and gang-style supervision in the earliest English colonial settings, especially before later plantation systems become more fully developed. In some places, labour appears more fluid and household-based. In others, supervision is already hardening into stricter control. The uncertainty comes partly from uneven records and partly from the messy nature of early colonial life itself. But whatever the exact arrangement, one point remains clear. Black workers are being placed in environments where labour discipline is becoming more racialised, more permanent in its assumptions, and more central to colonial wealth. You can see this in the way effort is watched. A master or overseer studies movement closely. Are you pausing too long? Did you miss a row? Did you carry enough? Did you answer quickly enough? Surveillance in a small colonial setting does not always require formal systems. Sometimes it is just a pair of eyes, a sharp tone, and a willingness to punish. That constant observation reshapes posture and expression. You conserve energy when you can. You hide fatigue when necessary. You learn that being seen is not always safe. Still, work is not pure silence. People exchange information inside it. A warning about a temper, advice on handling a tool, quiet humour about someone's absurd vanity, a reminder to save scraps, a word of comfort, a fragment of song under the breath. Human connection survives in these narrow spaces, though often carefully. The workday may belong to power, but small portions of speech still belong to people. That matters. It keeps the world from closing entirely. The body becomes a record keeper. It remembers routines so deeply that movements turn automatic. Bend, lift, turn, tie, stir, carry, return, repeat. After months or years, The labour settles into muscle memory. There is a strange cruelty in that. A body can become highly skilled at work it never chose. The very grace of motion may reflect coercion rather than pride. Yet skill remains real. A well-tied bundle, a carefully managed fire, a straight furrow, a repaired wall. Competence persists even where freedom does not. Nightfall brings release only in the narrowest sense. The formal tasks may stop, but the body continues labouring through soreness, through mending clothes, through preparing food, through caring for children, through finding a little order in cramped quarters. The air cools, smoke drifts lower. Crickets and frogs begin their steady music outside. Inside, someone shifts on rough bedding. Someone rubs a sore wrist. Someone stares for a moment into the red glow of coals, enjoying perhaps the only part of the day that asks nothing immediate. So what was work really like? It was varied, physical, closely watched, and relentless. It involved fields and kitchens, barns and yards, smokehouses and riverbanks. It demanded strength, patience, precision, and obedience, while giving little back beside survival. For black Americans in 1630, labour was not simply an economic role. It was the daily structure through which control was exercised and racial hierarchy was sharpened. Every task carried the colony's larger message. Your time is not your own. Your body is expected. Your effort is assumed. Your exhaustion is ordinary. And yet within that hard pattern, people still carried intelligence, humour, caution, memory, and skill into each day's work. They knew the weight of buckets, the moods of weather, the habits of crops, the tricks of fire, the weak places in a fence, the smell of food just before it burned, the sound of anger in a voice before the words arrived. They lived inside labour without becoming nothing but labour. The colony tried very hard to reduce them to function. It never fully succeeded. That quiet failure belongs to the workers, and it matters more than the masters understood. You learn a great deal about a society by examining the things it expects people to endure without complaint. In 1630, the answer is quite a lot. Clothing scratches, beds sag, food runs thin, walls leak, smoke stings the eyes. The whole colonial world seems built on the assumption that discomfort is normal, and that some people should bear much more of it than others. For black Americans in these early settlements, material life is not merely plain. It is tightly rationed, carefully controlled, and shaped by a constant awareness that the bare necessities are often distributed by people who see generosity as a suspicious habit. You begin with clothing because it touches the body all day and has an impressive talent for making hardship feel personal. Garments in the early colonies are usually simple, coarse, and practical. Linen shirts, woolen petticoats, waistcoats, breeches, stockings if available, aprons for work, head coverings in some households, and shoes that can be stiff, badly fitted, or missing altogether. New clothing is not common. Much of what labouring people wear is patched, altered, handed down, or cut from rough fabric chosen for durability rather than comfort. The cloth can rub the neck, chafe under the arms, and stiffen unpleasantly after repeated wear and washing. When the weather turns warm, clothing traps sweat. When the weather turns cold, it often fails to keep enough warmth close to the skin. Dampness is the true villain. It seeps into fabric, bedding, walls, and bones with quiet persistence. A wool garment that seems sturdy by the fire can feel miserably heavy after fog, rain, or a day in wet fields. Shoes, when present, soak through and then dry awkwardly, hardening into shapes apparently designed by somebody who resented feet on principle. Bare feet fare no better. Mud grips the skin, stones bruise, and winter cold bites sharply. For black labourers, clothing may be assigned sparingly according to household resources and the priorities of the master. Better garments are generally reserved for those with status, not for those doing the hardest work. A person may own very few changes of clothes, making cleanliness difficult in a world already full of smoke, sweat, and dirt. Washing is laborious, drying can be slow, and garments wear out quickly under heavy use. The result is a bodily life of friction. Cloth against skin, wet hem against ankle, rough seam against shoulder. Small irritations, repeated endlessly, become part of the texture of existence. Shelter offers little escape from this. Early colonial buildings are often crude by later standards, even in households that imagine themselves respectable. Walls may be made from timber and daub or from simple planks. Roofs leak, gaps let in drafts, insects, and the smell of wet earth. Floors can be rough boards or packed dirt. Windows, if present, may be small and unglazed or covered in oiled cloth rather than glass. A room can be dim even in daylight, with corners holding shadow and smoke in equal measure. Colonial people speak proudly of building homes, but many dwellings feel more like ongoing arguments with weather. Sleeping arrangements reveal hierarchy with painful clarity. Those with power claim private rooms, bedsteads, feather mattresses, blankets, trunks, and perhaps a little decorative comfort if fortune smiles. Labouring people, including black workers, are far more likely to sleep in lofts, shared spaces, corners of larger rooms, outbuildings, or makeshift quarters with little privacy. Bedding may be straw-filled, thin, and alive with the occasional unwelcome resident that nobody invited but everybody seems forced to host. The body rests where it can, a narrow pallet, a rough blanket, a spot near the wall. Sleep becomes a practical act rather than a luxurious one. At night you feel the material world most clearly. Boards press against hips and shoulders. Straw shifts under weight. A blanket smells faintly of smoke, damp wool, and old use. Wind threads through cracks in the wall. In summer the air may feel close and sticky, carrying the whine of insects. In winter the cold slips under every layer with rude confidence. People sleep near one another not always from affection, but from necessity, because shared warmth is still warmth. Privacy is rare. You hear breathing, coughing, a child turning over, the small creaks of a building settling into darkness. Food is another measure of what life is really like. Early colonial diets vary by season, region, and household means. But for many labouring people, the menu is repetitive, simple, and often insufficient. Cornmeal appears often because it is practical and abundant compared to imported grains. Peas, beans, and coarse bread help fill the stomach. Salted fish and pork are common when available, though heavily salted meat has a way of turning every meal into a negotiation between hunger and disappointment. Stews stretch ingredients. Pottage appears in many forms. Fresh produce comes and goes with the seasons and with access to gardens. The smell of food can be comforting even when the meal is plain. A pot of peas simmering over the fire sends up warm earthy steam. Corn cakes toast on a surface blackened by use. Fish, when fresh, carries the clean, sharp scent of river or sea. But when stored too long it can announce itself from a truly offensive distance. Salt pork hisses in the pan and perfumes the room with richness that vanishes rather quickly once divided into small portions. Smoke settles into everything. Bread tastes faintly of the hearth. Stew tastes of the pot. For black Americans, food may also carry memory in painful ways. Familiar ingredients from African homelands are often absent or difficult to obtain. New grains, new cooking vessels, new routines, new expectations all shape the daily act of eating. Yet adaptation happens. People use available ingredients with skill, building meals from scraps and staples while preserving techniques of seasoning, boiling, pounding, roasting, or combining foods in practical ways. Cultural continuity can survive quietly in the pot, even when the pantry has changed. A person may not have the old ingredients, but still remember what good cooking means. A quirky little truth of colonial kitchens is that many settlers remain oddly dramatic about food. They complain about monotony, about corn, about the lack of familiar English dishes, about the state of their beer, about butter, bread, weather, gardens, and nearly everything else that lands on a table. This would be more charming if they were the ones doing all the cooking. Usually they are not. There is something eternal about powerful people treating food as a stage for disappointment while others carry the real burden of preparing it. Water matters too, though it rarely receives much romance. It must be fetched, hauled, stored, and guarded from contamination as best anyone can manage. Wells, streams, and rivers provide supply, but not always safety. Water can taste of earth, iron, wood, or stagnation depending on its source. Beer and cider are often consumed because they can be safer than questionable water, and because colonists possess a heroic inability to imagine life without fermented drink. For labourers, carrying water is a daily strain. Buckets bite into the hands, yokes press on the shoulders. A spilled load means more walking. Historians still debate how much autonomy enslaved or semi-enslaved black people in the earliest English colonies had over gardens, food preparation, or personal household spaces. In later periods, evidence more clearly shows small garden plots and self-provisioning in some places. In 1630, the record is murkier. Some households may have allowed limited control over small spaces or extra food production. Others surely did not. The uncertainty reflects the colony's unsettled social order and the thinness of documentation. But uncertainty on paper never means an easy life in practice. It usually means that power operated unevenly and often without scrutiny. Material possessions for black labourers are generally few: a wooden bowl, a spoon, a blanket, a headcloth, a knife perhaps, though tools are often monitored because anything useful may also be seen as dangerous. Personal objects matter greatly in such conditions because they hold continuity. A small item can carry memory, utility, and identity all at once. The tragedy is that so many possessions are denied, lost, or reduced to the strictly necessary. Colonial poverty affects many, but racial hierarchy decides who is most likely to remain at the edge of bare survival. The atmosphere inside early homes is unforgettable. Smoke from the hearth lingers in hair, cloth, and rafters, animal grease, damp wood, soap, ash, herbs, and human bodies produce a thick domestic scent that changes only slightly from room to room. In better spaces, beeswax, dried flowers, or cleaner linen may soften the air. In rougher quarters, mildew and stale bedding press closer. Touching a table may leave your fingers dusty with meal or ash. Leaning against a wall may leave traces of daub on a sleeve. Nothing here is polished for long. Life keeps rubbing against every surface. There is also the matter of warmth. Fire is precious, but fuel is labour. Wood must be cut, carried, stacked, dried, and fed into the hearth. To keep a room warm means somebody has already spent hours preparing that comfort. Labouring people often feel heat most directly while working near a fire, then feel the cold return the moment the task is done. Hands redden from washing in chill water, feet ache after standing on cold floors. Winter air sneaks into beds and sleeves. Even in warmer climates, damp cold can be a mean little tyrant. Children grow up learning these material facts without ceremony. They know how smoke makes the eyes water. They know the smell of wet wool and the misery of cold mornings. They know which corner is warmer, which floorboard catches a toe, which pot is least likely to scorch, which blanket itches less. Black children in these settings learn all of this while also learning that comfort is not allocated fairly. A finer garment on one body and a coarser one on another becomes a lesson in hierarchy before anyone names it aloud. And yet people still make things livable where they can. A garment is patched carefully so it lasts longer. Bedding is shaken out and aired in thin sunlight. Herbs are hung to dry. A hearth is arranged for maximum heat. A stew is improved with whatever seasoning can be found. A room is swept. A bowl is mended. These acts are not grand, but they matter. They reveal a human instinct to build order and dignity even inside conditions that are mean, cramped, and controlled by others. So what were food, clothing, and shelter really like for black Americans in 1630? They were limited, rough, and deeply unequal. Clothing protected only imperfectly. Shelter kept out only some of the world. Food sustained the body but rarely invited pleasure for long. Every material necessity came wrapped in labour and in the authority of those who controlled distribution. Yet within these narrow margins, people still cooked, patched, warmed, cleaned, arranged, and endured. They made life from too little. They preserved habits of care in places not designed for comfort. That may sound modest, but it is one of history's most stubborn forms of courage. You live in a colony that has not fully finished righting its cruelty, which in some ways makes the place even more unsettling. Fixed rules, however unjust, at least announce themselves plainly. Virginia and the wider English colonial world in 1630 still operate with something messier. Categories are forming, but not yet sealed. Status can look negotiable in one record and merciless in the next. A person might hear one argument in church, another in court, and a third in the field, all before supper. For black Americans, this unstable moment creates a daily life shaped not by freedom, but by uncertainty that nearly always favours the powerful. You begin to notice how obsessed colonial society is with sorting people. The colony sorts by birth, by religion, by wealth, by gender, by skin colour, by whether a person arrived as servant, sailor, captive, wife, child, or landholder. It is a society making lists in its head all day long. Some lists determine who can vote, who can own land, who can testify, who can marry with approval, who can be punished more harshly, who is assumed to belong to someone else. In 1630, these categories are not yet arranged into the later, colder architecture of hereditary racial slavery, but the scaffolding is there, and people are already climbing it with alarming enthusiasm. The legal language of the time can be frustratingly vague. Court records, contracts, parish notes, and inventories do not always classify black people in one consistent way. Some Africans appear in conditions that resemble term servitude. Others are clearly treated as permanent property in practice, even when the documents wobble around the edges. A white servant might serve for years and then expect release. A black labourer might hear similar words spoken nearby, yet discover those words do not function the same way when applied to his own body. Colonial law is often less a neat code than a collection of local habits, court decisions, and profitable assumptions pretending to be reason. That is what makes this period so dangerous. The rules are still being made, which means power has room to improvise. And power, as it turns out, improvises badly. You hear debates that sound almost absurd in their detachment from lived reality. Does baptism change status? Does a Christian master owe different treatment to a Christian servant or captive? Can a black person serve for life without a clear contract? Should a child inherit the condition of a parent? These questions move through colonial thinking because the colony wants labour, wants order, wants moral excuses, and would very much like all three at once. It is trying to build a system that feels profitable and respectable, which is a difficult trick unless one is willing to sacrifice respectability entirely. The colonists prove quite willing. Religion sits awkwardly in the middle of this. English colonists speak often about Christian duty, moral conduct, and the saving of souls. Church bells ring, sermons rise, prayers expected. Yet the same society also buys, disciplines, and controls black labour in ways that make its spiritual language sound painfully selective. Some people argue that baptism should create obligations of fellowship. Others quietly worry that too much spiritual equality might interfere with ownership. It is one of the uglier little puzzles of early colonial life. What happens when a society wants the glow of Christian virtue without surrendering the profits of domination. For Black Americans, baptism can hold multiple meanings. It may offer a sincere spiritual path, a chance at community, a new name, or a fragile claim to recognition. It may also be used by colonists as another tool of management, another ceremony in which identity is renamed under someone else's authority. Historians still disagree about how often baptism meaningfully improved legal or social standing in these early decades. In some local cases, it may have helped. In many others, it did not. The colony, after all, is already learning how to separate Christian rhetoric from humane treatment with unnerving efficiency. Skin colour grows more important in this process, even before statutes fully harden the distinction. You can see it in everyday assumptions. A white servant may be worked brutally, whipped, or cheated, yet still imagined as someone with an eventual place inside English society. A black labourer is more often treated as a person whose place may remain permanently outside that circle. The difference is not always announced in formal language at first. Sometimes it appears in the way people speak, the way punishment is justified, the way freedom is delayed, the way suspicion attaches itself to one body more quickly than another. This is how systems often begin, not with a single trumpet blast of law, but with repeated choices that make one outcome more likely than another. In court, these choices matter enormously. Early colonial courts handled disputes over service, labour, punishment, and obligation in ways that reveal a society still testing its own boundaries. Black people do appear in the record. Some sue, some testify indirectly or through others. Some are named in disputes over terms of service. These glimpses show that the system is not yet perfectly sealed. There are cracks, arguments, and inconsistencies. But cracks in an unjust system are not the same as justice. They are simply places where the shape of unfairness is not settled yet. A quirky but revealing detail from the period is how much colonial authority depends on paperwork in places that are otherwise astonishingly rough and improvised. A settlement may have muddy roads, leaky roofs, bad sanitation, and livestock wandering where livestock should not wander, yet still produce documents with grand confidence about ownership and status. The contrast is almost comic. Somebody can barely keep chickens out of the doorway and still feel entirely qualified to define another human being's legal condition for life. Colonial bureaucracy has a very serious voice and often deserves a raised eyebrow. The family becomes another legal battleground. Marriage, parenthood, inheritance, and household order are all tied to status. If a black woman bears a child, what is that child's standing? If a black man forms a union, will it be recognised? Can kinship protect anyone from sale, transfer, or coercion? In 1630, the answers are often unstable and local, but the instability itself is revealing. Colonial society is probing where race and labour will meet family life, and the pressure is already pushing toward harsher conclusions. The law has not yet completed its later formulas, but it is circling them. You feel this uncertainty most in the emotional tone of daily life. A person may not know whether years of labour will ever end in release. A verbal promise may exist, but who will honour it? A baptism may occur, but what will it change? A child may be born, but under what future? Hope becomes cautious. Trust becomes expensive. Every conversation about status carries risk because the answer depends not only on principle, but on who holds local power, what profit is at stake, and which custom a court chooses to notice on that particular day. The colony also borrows from several worlds at once. English common law offers one set of habits. Practices from the Caribbean and Iberian Atlantic offer others. Merchants, planters, and officials are not inventing racial control from scratch in complete isolation. They watch, adapt, and import ideas. Some forms of lifelong bondage have older precedents in Europe and Africa, but the English colonies are beginning to tie bondage more systematically to blackness in a way that will become increasingly distinctive. Scholars continue to debate exactly how fast this shift occurs and how consciously colonists understand what they are building. Yet the direction is visible. The law is learning to notice colour more sharply. Inside households, rules can be both intimate and arbitrary. A master may allow one person limited movement, deny another the same liberty, punish one offence severely, overlook another when it suits him, promise future freedom, then behave as though no such promise existed. This inconsistency is not merely confusion, it is a form of control. When the rule can change at the whim of power, obedience becomes defensive. You do not only follow commands, you try to predict moods, ambitions, and fears. Legal uncertainty becomes a condition of the nervous system. Language reflects all this. The colony does not always have settled terms, but it has revealing ones. Servant, Negro, Christian, heathen, man, wench, boy, woman. Labels slide around, sometimes descriptive, sometimes diminishing, sometimes designed to obscure the exact nature of coercion. A record may call someone a servant when the lived condition looks far harsher. Another may identify a person chiefly by colour, reducing everything else to background. Names are shortened, altered, or omitted. Legal identity in the colony is often a story told by someone else, with a great many important details removed. And yet black people are not passive subjects floating through this process like driftwood in legal ink. They negotiate where possible. They observe. They appeal. They form relationships. They adopt Christianity or resist it. Use English when necessary. Preserve older beliefs when possible. And test the colony's own claims against its behaviour. Some seek formal recognition of promises. Some rely on patrons. Some build indispensable skills that create limited leverage. None of this cancels vulnerability. But it does show people thinking actively within oppressive conditions, not merely enduring them without response. There is also the matter of reputation. In a small colony, people know a great deal about one another. They know who cheats contracts, who drinks too much, who beats workers, who borrows constantly, who prays loudly, who pays poorly, who lies in court with a face as calm as Sunday dinner. Reputation affects outcomes, though unevenly. A powerful man's bad character may be tolerated. A black person's smallest perceived fault may be enlarged. This imbalance is one more way law grows racial roots before fully declaring them. Credibility itself becomes unequal. The physical atmosphere of this legal world is easy to miss because law sounds abstract. But law in 1630 happens in rooms, cramped rooms, rooms that smell of damp wool, candle smoke, mud tracked in on boots, and ink drying on rough paper. Voices rise and fall, chairs scrape, someone coughs. Outside, wind moves through the yard, and labour continues as though nothing important is being decided. Yet inside, a term of service may be extended, a status clarified, a punishment ordered, a child's future narrowed. Great systems of injustice often arrive in ordinary spaces. By evening, the colony returns to its routines of eating, mending, and sleep. But the uncertainty remains. You lie down knowing the law does not exist somewhere far away in splendid books. It lives in the decisions of neighbours, masters, magistrates, ministers, and clerks. It lives in whether your word counts, whether a promise is remembered, whether a conversion is honoured, whether your child is seen as human first or as labour first. In that sense, the colony's unfinished legal order is not a temporary technical issue. It is the climate of the soul. So what does it mean to live between servitude and slavery in 1630? It means living in a world where the line is not always clearly drawn in language, but is increasingly clear in power. It means the colony has not fully settled its formulas, yet is already shaping black life toward deeper dependency, longer control, and more racial distinction. It means religion, Law and custom overlap without resolving in mercy. It means that uncertainty is rarely neutral. It bends toward profit. It bends toward ownership. It bends toward permanence. And still, within that tightening space, black people continue to think, judge, adapt, and preserve some measure of inner self against a society trying very hard to define them from the outside. The colonists may argue over categories, but the people living under those categories know the practical truth. When your freedom depends on somebody else's interpretation, you're already in dangerous country. You discover very quickly that family in 1630 is not only a matter of affection, it is a matter of risk. Love exists, loyalty exists, tenderness exists, but all of them must live inside a world that does not reliably respect black bonds as sacred or permanent. A parent may hold a child and still know that authority over that child lies elsewhere. A husband may speak softly to a wife at day's end and still have no legal power to protect her from transfer, punishment, or sudden removal. In the early English colonies, kinship survives under pressure, and that pressure is constant enough to shape how people speak, trust, and hope. You begin in the crowded, practical spaces where family life actually happens, not in grand portraits, not in the polished language of moral instruction, in the half-light of a cabin corner, near a hearth that smokes more than it should, at a rough table where food is portioned carefully, beside bedding laid close because space is short and warmth matters. Here you hear the sounds of private life trying to exist. A child's sleepy question, a low laugh, the rustle of cloth, someone humming while mending, the little hush that falls when footsteps approach from outside. For black Americans, family in 1630 can take many forms. Some arrive in the colonies with relatives, though this is often prevented by sale and transport practices that break groups apart. Many are forced to build kinship from scratch in unfamiliar places. Bonds form between spouses, between parents and children, between unrelated elders and younger people, between those who share language, labour, faith, or grief. Family becomes both biological and chosen because survival rarely offers the luxury of strict definitions. A person who teaches you, feeds you, warns you, or comforts you may become as necessary as blood. That does not make the losses easier. The Atlantic slave trade and colonial labour systems are designed, in part, to make separation ordinary. Sale divides people, death divides people. Assignment to different households divides people. The raw conditions of early colonial life, with its disease and instability, create additional breaks. A person may lose a parent to fever, a child to malnutrition, a spouse to transfer, a sibling to distance that is not measured in miles alone but in legal control. Even when no dramatic removal occurs, family life is shadowed by uncertainty. You do not know which tie will be tested next. One mainstream historical truth is that the law in the English colonies does not yet fully formalise every later rule about hereditary slavery in 1630, yet family life is already deeply vulnerable because black relationships are not given equal protection. Recognition is uneven. Promises are unreliable. A union may be emotionally real and socially understood, but not firmly defended by legal institutions. This matters because law is not only a thing that punishes, it is also a thing that shields. And black families in these years receive much less shielding. You see this vulnerability in ordinary decisions. Where does a couple sleep? Who cares for a child when adults are sent to separate tasks? Can a mother keep an infant near her while working? Is an older child allowed to help a younger one? Does a master permit a visit between people attached to different households? Each question sounds small. Together they form the real architecture of domestic life. In a controlled society, power enters through the door of routine. Family is not broken only by spectacular events. It is also worn down by the management of daily access. Children occupy a particularly delicate place in this world. They absorb language quickly, They learn the smells and sounds of the colony before they can explain them. Smoke in cloth, salt pork boiling, mud after rain, a door hinge creaking at dawn. They also learn hierarchy with alarming speed. They notice who gives orders, who receives them, whose body is watched, whose tears are soothed, whose are dismissed. A black child does not need a legal lecture to understand unequal power. The lesson arrives through tone, timing, and consequence. Parents still try to teach what they can. How to carry yourself carefully, how to listen before speaking, how to remember a name, how to hold a bowl without spilling precious food, how to avoid provoking anger, how to recognize danger in a room before danger becomes action. This is family instruction in a harsh world. It is practical and loving at once. A lesson about obedience may not reflect surrender. It may reflect a parent's desperate wish to keep a child alive. There is also warmth, real warmth. A mother's hand smoothing hair, a father lifting a tired child for a few steps at the end of the day, a shared meal made slightly better by conversation, someone telling a story at night in a low voice so others can rest. These moments matter because they contradict the colony's effort to reduce black life to labour alone. Family restores personhood in ways the system cannot fully control. To be cherished by someone is to receive proof that you are more than a role imposed by power. A quirky but telling detail of colonial family life more broadly is how often people speak as though the household is the centre of moral order, while running households that are chaotic, crowded, and dependent on coercion. Masters and mistresses may imagine themselves guardians of discipline and virtue, yet their own homes are full of quarrels, shortages, illness, debt, and contradiction. The ideal household in colonial writing sounds stable and pious. The real one often smells of smoke and fatigue. For black families living inside or adjacent to such households, this gap between ideal and reality is impossible to miss. Marriage itself can be fragile territory. Formal Christian marriage may be encouraged in some settings and ignored or obstructed in others. Some couples form unions recognized by community custom rather than by church ceremony. Some never receive either recognition, though their commitment is plain to those around them. Historians still debate how often early black marriages in the English colonies were formally sanctioned, and what practical protection such sanction offered. The uncertainty reflects the period's unstable legal world, but the emotional truth is clearer. Partnership existed, and it mattered. Even when colonial institutions refused to honour it fully, pregnancy and childbirth bring both hope and fear. A pregnant woman must continue labour under difficult conditions, often with little rest and limited medical support. The body bears strain from work, diet, stress, and environment. Childbirth in the 17th century is dangerous for women across the colony, but black women face additional vulnerability because their comfort, recovery, and autonomy carry less weight in the eyes of those controlling labour. Even joy arrives nervously. A child is beloved, yes, but also exposed to a world already narrowing around race. Women often anchor family survival through invisible labour. Cooking, mending, washing, tending children, caring for the sick, preserving scraps of order, and passing on memory all happen beside or after more visible work. This domestic labour is easy for the colony to take for granted because it is so essential. A child fed, soothed, and taught does not remain alive by accident. A household with a little cleanliness, a little rhythm, a little tenderness has usually been held together by someone working beyond exhaustion. Black women carry much of this burden while receiving the least secure claim to the family worlds they help sustain. Men, too, face specific frustrations in family life under coercive conditions. A father may be expected to labour hard yet denied authority over his own home. He may feel responsible without being granted recognised power. He may protect where he can, advise where he can, provide comfort where he can, and still know that a master's decision can override him in an instant. This creates a painful emotional condition. Duty remains. Control does not. A man may be judged by standards of care while being denied the means to guarantee safety. Yet families improvise. They create rituals in small forms, a phrase said at night, a way of blessing food, a song used to calm an infant, a name repeated carefully so it's not lost, a story about a place across the water, a proverb, a gesture of respect for elders. These practices may seem modest to outsiders, but they preserve continuity. Family is not only shelter or legal status, it is a method of carrying memory through unstable conditions. Scholars continue to argue over how much direct retention of African kinship structures remained possible in these early colonial years, especially when the black population in many places was still relatively small and scattered. Some stress severe disruption and forced adaptation. Others point to enduring patterns of naming, childcare, mutual obligation, and respect for seniority that suggest African social knowledge remained active. The evidence is incomplete, and certainty is difficult, but incomplete evidence should not be mistaken for empty lives. Much of what families did mattered precisely because it happened outside the official record. Death visits often enough to shape how people love. Early colonial disease, malnutrition, and hard labour make every attachment feel a little precarious. Funerary customs for black people are poorly documented in many early English colonial settings, but grief certainly exists, and communities certainly find ways to mark it. A pause, a prayer, a shared silence, a remembered name, perhaps a song too soft for official ears. Mourning does not disappear because the archive is careless. It simply leaves fainter traces on paper than in human hearts. The atmosphere of evening holds some of the clearest evidence of family persistence. After work, the air cools and the settlement quiets by degrees. You smell ash, damp grass, and the lingering scent of cooked corn or stew. A child leans into an elder's side. Someone braids hair by firelight. Someone rubs sore feet. Conversation stays low, but it is conversation still. In these moments, kinship is not theoretical. It is a hand passing bread. It is space made on a pallet. It is a warning given softly. It is someone noticing that you are tired before you say a word. Of course, danger never fully leaves. A transfer may come. A punishment may disrupt the household. A death may empty a corner of the room. A child may be sent elsewhere for service or labour. Black families cannot assume permanence because the system is not built to honour their permanence. That knowledge sits quietly inside every joy, not destroying it entirely, but making it more fragile. You love while knowing loss may arrive without permission. It is a hard way to love, but people do it anyway. So what was family life really like for black Americans in 1630? It was tender and threatened at the same time. It was made from blood ties when possible, chosen ties when necessary, and daily acts of care under conditions that constantly undermined security. It included marriage, parenting, teaching, grieving, and memory. But all under a social order that treated black relationships as less worthy of protection. The colony could interrupt, deny, or ignore those bonds. Yet it could not prevent them from forming. And that may be the most important truth here. Even in the early days, when law was uncertain and power was improvising toward harsher forms, black people still built lives of attachment. They held children. They trusted partners. They honoured elders. They shared food, stories, and caution. They made family where the world made family difficult. That labour of love was as real as any work in the field, and far more human. It kept dignity alive in rooms where the colony expected only obedience. You hear the colony before you understand it. English voices clipped by region and class. Church prayers spoken with solemn effort. Orders tossed across a yard. Laughter cut short when someone important passes. The scrape of a stool on rough boards. The crackle of a fire eating damp wood. For Black Americans in 1630, sound is never just background. It is instruction, warning, memory, and sometimes comfort. In a world where so much is unstable, what people say, how they say it, and what they keep hidden inside song, prayer, or silence can matter as much as food or shelter. Faith is part of that world from the beginning, though not in one simple form. English colonies imagine themselves Christian places. Church attendance matters. Ministers preach order, obedience, salvation, and the duties of a proper society. Psalms are sung, prayers are memorized, children are instructed. Sin is discussed with such persistence that you begin to suspect the colonists have given it rather a lot of material to work with. Yet for black people, religion in the colony is never only what English authorities intend. It is also what individuals receive, reshape, compare, question, and preserve under pressure. Some Africans arriving in English America come from societies already touched by Christianity, especially in parts of West Central Africa, where Portuguese influence and older missionary networks have left marks. Others come from Islamic regions or from religious traditions rooted in ancestors. Spirits, sacred landscapes, healing practices, and communal ritual. Many carry systems of meaning that do not fit neatly into English categories. The colony tends to flatten this variety, because colonial minds are often suspicious of complexity unless it appears on their own side of the ledger. But lived experience is richer than that. A person may hear a Christian sermon and still hold older beliefs close. A person may accept baptism and still remember a sacred rhythm from home. That combination creates a quiet religious layering. In a smoky room at dusk, someone may bow a head at a prayer taught by English Christians, then later murmur words or intentions that belong to another world of meaning. Historians still debate how openly African spiritual practices survived in these earliest English colonial settings, where numbers were smaller and surveillance could be intense. Some argue continuity must have been limited and fragmented. Others point to the stubborn persistence of protective rituals, healing knowledge, naming practices, and reverence for ancestors. The evidence is incomplete, but the possibility of layered belief is strong, because human beings rarely surrender meaning all at once. The church itself can feel both grand and shabby, which is a very colonial combination. A meeting house may be simple, drafty, and uncomfortable, yet filled with confidence about eternal truth. You smell damp wool, wood smoke, tallow, and the faint sourness of many bodies pressed together. Benches are hard, windows let in a grey light. A minister's voice rises and falls over the room, speaking of grace, judgment, and obedience. Black listeners may be present inside the setting, but not on equal terms. Their bodies are welcomed or tolerated according to the colony's needs, while their souls are often discussed as if they were part of somebody else's moral project, and yet religious language can still carry real power. Stories from the Bible speak of bondage, wandering, deliverance, suffering, and justice. Even when ministers emphasize submission, listeners can hear something else in the text. A person does not need permission to notice that Pharaoh was not the hero. Faith travels strangely like that. Once a story enters a room, it cannot always be forced to mean only one thing. Language itself is a field of adaptation. Africans brought into English colonies may speak Kimbundu, Kikongo, Wolof, Mandi languages, Igbo-related tongues, or many others depending on place of origin and route of sail. In early colonial settings, this creates a practical problem and a human opportunity. How do you communicate when the people around you use unfamiliar sounds? You listen, you test words, you borrow, you simplify, you repeat. Communication grows through necessity, a gesture first, then a noun, then a command, then a warning, then perhaps a joke once the mouth trusts the sound enough to try it. English in the colonies is hardly elegant to begin with. It comes in many accents, many levels of education, many rough edges. Sailors speak differently from planters, servants speak differently from ministers, regional habits from England, Ireland, Scotland, and elsewhere mixed together. Black newcomers hear all this and must sort it under pressure. Which words matter immediately? Which ones signal danger? Which ones are prayers? Which ones are lies? Language learning in such conditions is not a charming scholarly exercise. It is survival. Still, something creative happens in the middle of that survival. People begin forming shared vocabularies across difference. Fragments of African languages may survive in names, rhythms, and expressions. English words are bent to new uses. Pronunciation shifts. Meaning adjusts to circumstance. These are the earliest ingredients of creolized communication, not yet polished into later forms, but already alive in practical exchange. A new linguistic world does not arrive with ceremony. It grows in kitchens, yards, fields, river landings, and whispered night conversations. A quirky truth of colonial communication is that misunderstanding is everywhere. Yet people keep conducting serious business with great confidence. Orders are half heard. Contracts are poorly explained. Religious concepts are translated badly. Names are misspelled by clerks who behave as though the fault lies in the person, not the pen. It would almost be funny if the stakes were not so high. A single misunderstood instruction can lead to punishment. A badly recorded name can erase a history. A mistranslated promise can alter a life. Names matter intensely. They carry lineage, affection, memory, and place. Colonial systems often rename black people with English or Christian names for convenience, ownership, or baptismal order. That practice is never a simple administrative choice. It is an attempt to interrupt continuity. Yet old names may survive quietly in speech between trusted people. A name spoken softly at night can preserve a world that official records do not care to see. The archive may call someone Mary, John, or Francis. The heart may know another name entirely. Music and rhythm likely play important roles even when documentation is thin. Work songs, humming, call and response habits, clapped patterns, and remembered melodies can survive in fragments. Scholars disagree on how much distinct African musical tradition can be traced clearly in the earliest English colonial decades, especially with so few records from black voices themselves. But rhythm is portable. Memory can live in the body. A person may not have an instrument, a ceremony, or a full community from home, yet still carry a pattern of sound in breath and hands. One beat tapped on wood, one melody softened into a lullaby, one repeated phrase that means more than outsiders understand. Healing traditions also belong to this realm of faith and memory. In the 17th century, medicine is a crowded and uncertain field for everyone. English remedies include herbs, bleeding, poultices, prayers, and confidence far beyond the available evidence. African knowledge systems bring their own understanding of plants, care, bodily balance, and spiritual influence. Black people in the colonies may draw on remembered medicinal practices while also navigating English expectations. A leaf steeped for fever, a root used for pain, a protective act around a sick child. Healing is rarely divided neatly into physical and spiritual categories in this era. Most people, in truth, live by mixtures. Atmosphere shapes belief too. Dawn mist over the river, the scent of pine after rain, moonlight through chinks in the wall, frogs calling from marsh grass, wind worrying the roof in winter. These things press on the senses and invite interpretation. A colony can be harsh enough to make every sign feel important. A strange dream, a sudden bird call, a recovery from illness, a storm breaking at the right moment. People notice patterns because uncertainty trains them to notice everything. Faith often lives in that attentive space between danger and hope. Black children learn memory differently from adults. They may not remember another continent directly, but they inherit fragments. A phrase repeated, a way of greeting, a food habit, a rhythm in a lullaby, a warning spoken with unusual seriousness. This is how culture continues under pressure, not always through grand ceremonies, but through repeated small acts that teach belonging. A child who hears an elder speak a name carefully may not understand the full story, yet still receive the shape of reverence. Identity can pass quietly, almost hidden inside ordinary life. English authorities sometimes assume that conversion and language learning will smooth black people into colonial order. They underestimate how selective adaptation can be. A person may learn English for protection without surrendering inner loyalties. A person may attend church and still measure the minister's message against another moral world. A person may repeat Christian prayers while silently rejecting the hypocrisy of those who preach them. Outward compliance and inward belief are not always identical. Oppressive systems often forget this because they confuse control of the body with possession of the mind. There are also moments of shared religious practice across lines of status, though always unevenly. A household prayer includes everyone in the room. A baptism gathers witnesses. A burial pauses labour briefly. These moments can produce real feeling, but they do not erase hierarchy. The same people kneeling under one prayer may stand again into a world of unequal authority. That contradiction is part of colonial religion's deepest discomfort. It asks for spiritual unity while preserving social division. By evening, when labour quiets enough for thought to stretch a little, language and memory often come closest together. Someone tells a child a story in the dim glow of the hearth. Someone repeats a proverb. Someone hums while stitching torn cloth. Someone offers a prayer over a sick body. The room smells of ash, cooked grain, and damp garments drying near the fire. Outside, insects pulse in the dark. Inside, voices stay low, not because their meaning is small, but because caution is wise. Much of what keeps a people whole is spoken softly. So what were faith, language, and memory really like for black Americans in 1630? They were mixed, adaptive, and deeply human. Christian teaching entered daily life, but not always on the terms colonists imagined. African beliefs and habits persisted in fragments, practices, and inward loyalties, even when records barely noticed them. Language became a tool of survival and creativity at once, built from listening, borrowing, and reshaping. Memory moved through names, stories, rhythms, healing practices, and family instruction. The colony wanted labour that could obey. What it received instead were people who could also remember, interpret, and transform. That difference mattered. It meant black life in the early English colonies was never only a story of what was imposed from above, it was also a story of what was carried within, guarded quietly, and passed on in forms small enough to survive but strong enough to endure. You learn that resistance in 1630 rarely looks dramatic from a distance. It is not always a great speech, a blazing revolt, or a clean escape into the horizon. More often, it is smaller, quieter, and folded into the ordinary motions of the day, a pause before obeying. A tool misplaced with suspicious convenience. A warning whispered at the right moment. A story withheld from the wrong ears. In the early English colonies, black Americans live under conditions of pressure so constant that resistance becomes not only an act, but a habit of mind. It is the stubborn refusal to let power define every thought, every relationship, every motion of the body. Punishment is the colony's answer to that refusal. The system depends on fear, and fear requires performance. Orders must be obeyed not only because work needs doing, but because authority wants to be seen, heard, and felt. In a settlement of rough buildings, muddy paths, and watchful households, punishment is public enough to carry a message, a raised voice in the yard, a threat delivered before others, a beating ordered not only to correct, but to instruct everyone watching. Colonial power has a theatrical side. It likes an audience. For black people, the danger of punishment is sharpened by uncertain legal standing and racial prejudice that is becoming more ingrained with every passing year. A white servant may be punished harshly, certainly, but a black labourer is more likely to face suspicion as a condition of existence. That suspicion alters the atmosphere of daily life. You must think ahead constantly. Who is watching? Who is in a mood to accuse? Which action will be read as defiance? Which silence will be taken as insolence? Survival requires reading human weather as carefully as the sky. The punishments themselves vary by household, colony, and circumstance. Whipping is common in the wider world of 17th century labour discipline, and black workers are especially vulnerable to it. Confinement, extra labour, food restriction, threats of sale or transfer, and various humiliations also appear. The exact form matters, but so does the anticipation of it. Fear does part of the work before the punishment begins. The body learns to brace. Muscles tighten at certain tones of voice. The stomach drops when a name is called sharply from across a yard. Anxiety becomes physical knowledge. A mainstream historical reality is that coercive labour systems survive only when resistance is constant enough to require constant management. The colony would not need so much surveillance, correction, and intimidation if people were naturally content in bondage. That very need tells you something important. Black resistance is not occasional. It is woven into the fabric of colonial life, even if the record often notices only the moments when authority feels challenged enough to respond. Escape is the form of resistance that most alarms masters because it attacks the system at its root. A runaway worker takes labour away, denies control, and exposes the fragility of ownership. But escape in 1630 is extremely difficult. The landscape is unfamiliar. Forests are dense. Rivers complicate movement. Language barriers can be dangerous. Nearby settlements may return runaways for reward or fear. Native communities might offer help in some circumstances, but such possibilities are uncertain and deeply shaped by local politics. A person fleeing does not move through empty wilderness. They move through a contested world full of risk. Still, people trip. That matters. An attempted escape, even if unsuccessful, reveals an inner line that power has not erased. The same is true of less visible forms of resistance. Feigned illness can buy a little time. Slowed labour can reduce a master's gains. Breakage can be accidental, or perhaps not entirely accidental. Information can be withheld. A child can be protected by a warning. A friend can be alerted to danger. An elder's counsel can prevent a worse outcome. These actions do not always appear heroic in the polished way later generations sometimes prefer. They are practical acts within dangerous limits, and practical courage is still courage. One quirky but revealing feature of colonial records is how often authorities complain about behaviour that plainly reflects human dignity while describing it as disorder. Talking back, absenting oneself, refusing certain tasks, or showing what they call stubbornness appears in the language of discipline because masters expect more than work. They expect submission of spirit. The moment a person reveals independent judgment, the system treats it as a problem to be solved. Colonial complaints can be unintentionally honest that way. They tell you what power fears most by listing what it condemns. Resistance also includes negotiation. Not every struggle happens through open defiance. A person may seek better treatment by becoming indispensable in a task, by appealing to a mistress rather than a master, by using Christian language to shame hypocrisy, by reminding an authority figure of a promise, or by playing one household interest against another. These are not signs of acceptance. They are survival strategies inside unequal conditions. Historians still debate how much room for bargaining truly existed in the earliest English colonies, especially for black workers whose status was increasingly precarious. But the evidence suggests that people did test boundaries where they could, because living under power does not erase the instinct to shape one's own condition. Silence can be resistance too. Not all knowledge is surrendered. A person may choose not to explain a healing remedy, not to reveal a private conversation, not to translate fully, not to expose another person's plan, not to share an inward belief with someone eager to control it. Silence in an oppressive world is rarely empty. It can be a wall, a shelter, a code, a refusal. Outsiders often mistake silence for passivity because they are listening only for noise that flatters their own understanding. The social world of resistance is important. Few people endure coercion entirely alone in spirit, even when isolated in practice. Advice travels in whispers, warnings pass through glances. Solidarity may be fragile, because fear and unequal treatment can divide people. But it exists. Shared suffering does not automatically create trust, yet trust grows where people prove themselves careful and loyal. A black worker may rely on another's judgment in a dangerous moment. A parent may teach a child what not to say. A friend may distract an overseer at the exact second someone else needs relief. These are small acts, but whole lives can turn on them. There is also resistance in memory. To remember your own worth when a society insists otherwise is not a sentimental detail. It is part of the struggle. A person who still judges a master's behaviour as unjust has not accepted the moral order being imposed. A person who keeps a private standard of dignity alive remains inwardly uncolonised in crucial ways. This inner resistance may not change immediate conditions, but it changes what domination can and cannot fully possess. Children witness all of this. They learn not only obedience, but the grammar of caution and the possibilities of quiet refusal. They see adults exchange glances that mean more than words. They notice when work slows deliberately. They hear the difference between genuine agreement and spoken compliance. A child in such a world becomes an expert observer very early. That is a heavy education. It can preserve life, but it also means innocence has very little room to stretch out and rest. Scholars continue to argue over how much organised collective resistance can be identified in the earliest English colonies, before the larger and more documented uprisings of later centuries. The evidence for major coordinated action in 1630 is sparse, partly because black populations are still relatively small in many areas, and partly because records are created by authorities more interested in punishment than understanding. But the absence of large-scale revolt in the archive does not imply acceptance. It more likely reflects the severe practical limits under which resistance had to operate. Small numbers, harsh surveillance, and unstable conditions tend to produce dispersed acts rather than grand ones. The physical setting shapes all this. Imagine the smell of split wood in a yard at dusk, the wet odour of marsh grass, the rasp of insects beyond the fence, the dim orange light of coals inside a cramped room. Resistance happens here, in such spaces, not in abstract categories. A woman chooses not to repeat a cruel remark to a child. A man hides his true thoughts behind a bowed head. Someone preserves a tool for a friend who will need it later. Someone quietly teaches another how to avoid punishment during a difficult task. Human will expresses itself in very material ways. Even emotion can become a contested field. Masters often expect gratitude for minor concessions, as though slightly reduced cruelty were a generous personality trait. Refusing inward gratitude for domination is itself a form of mental resistance. The colony tries to teach dependence wrapped in obligation. Yet many black people clearly understand the difference between necessity and loyalty. They comply because conditions demand it, not because power has earned their respect. That distinction can never be fully erased. However much authority wishes otherwise, at times, resistance fails visibly. An escape attempt is discovered. A protest brings harsher punishment. A negotiation is denied. A person protecting another is exposed. These moments are painful, and the consequences can be severe. It would be dishonest to pretend every act of defiance brings a satisfying result. Most oppressive systems are built precisely to make resistance costly. Yet failure does not make the act meaningless. It proves the desire for autonomy remains alive. It proves coercion has limits, even if those limits are not yet enough to break the system. Night often holds the clearest sense of inward freedom. Not full freedom, of course. The walls remain, the commands remain, tomorrow's labour remains. But in darkness, the colony's gaze weakens a little. People think, they remember, they whisper, they pray, they weigh whom to trust. They imagine other possibilities, even if only briefly. Outside, frogs pulse from the water's edge. Wind brushes the trees. Inside, someone lies awake listening and planning nothing grander than how to preserve a little more self by morning. That, too, is resistance. So what were punishment and resistance really like for Black Americans in 1630? Punishment was frequent, performative, and designed to make fear productive. It used pain, humiliation, and uncertainty to defend a labour system that knew it was unnatural. Resistance took many forms because it had to. Escape, delay, concealment, negotiation, silence, mutual warning, inward dignity, and quiet sabotage all belong to the landscape of survival. None of these acts erased the colony's power, but they exposed its insecurity. That may be the deepest truth in this difficult subject. A system that needs constant watching, constant threatening, and constant correction is not strong in the moral sense. It is brittle. It knows people do not consent to their own domination, so it must keep proving it can force them. Black Americans in 1630 understood that reality from the underside. They endured punishment, certainly, but they also kept testing the edges of control. In that testing lived courage, intelligence, and will. The colony could command bodies for long hours. It could not fully command the human impulse to resist being owned. You stand in a colony that still looks improvised on the surface. The roads are rough, the house is draughty, the stores uncertain, the weather rude, and the administration only slightly more organised than a spilled box of nails. Yet underneath that roughness, something far more durable is taking shape. The English colonial world in 1630 has not yet completed the legal machine of racial slavery that later generations will know so well, but it is already moving in that direction with steady purpose. What begins as uneven practice is becoming habit. What begins as habit is becoming expectation. And expectation, in colonial hands, has a dangerous way of hardening into law. The change does not arrive in one neat moment. It thickens. That is the unsettling part. You can watch a society teach itself to become more systematic in its unfairness. Planters want labour that lasts longer, costs less over time, and stays under tighter control. Merchants want reliable profits. Officials want social order that protects property and calms the anxieties of those with land. Ministers want moral language that can coexist with economic appetite. Put all of this together, and you get a colony steadily training itself to see blackness not merely as difference, but as a category tied to permanent labour and inherited subordination. Tobacco drives much of this transformation. The crop remains greedy. It wants more land, more hands, more discipline, more predictability. As tobacco profits grow, colonial ambitions grow with them. Small holdings push outward. Larger estates begin to imagine themselves as stable centres of wealth. A labour force based only on short-term English indentured servants has limits. Servants can finish terms. They can demand land, wages, or opportunity. They can become competitors. They can complain with the full confidence of people who expect someday to stand within the political community. For colonial elites, that is inconvenient. A labour system tied increasingly to black bondage promises something they find more appealing. Endurance without entitlement. This shift is not purely economic, though economics gives it strong legs. It is also social and psychological. White colonists begin to understand that racial distinction can serve as glue for a fragile hierarchy. if poor and landless white people can still imagine themselves above black labourers, then class tensions may be softened, redirected, or at least rearranged. That lesson will become more explicit later, but the early shape of it is already visible. Race offers the colony a cruel shortcut to solidarity among Europeans who might otherwise notice more clearly how unequally their own world is arranged. You feel this hardening in ordinary assumptions. A black person's freedom becomes easier to doubt. A white person's claim to eventual independence becomes easier to imagine. A child born to one family is viewed with one set of expectations, while a child born to another is drawn into a narrower future. The colony does not need to say all of this aloud at first. Repetition does the work. One decision in a court, one inheritance dispute, one labour arrangement extended beyond fairness, one baptism treated as spiritually useful but socially limited, one household teaching its children who commands and who obeys. Structure grows through repeated acts. A mainstream fact of 17th century English America is that the legal codification of hereditary racial slavery develops more fully over the decades after 1630, especially in places like Virginia. But to look only at the later statutes would miss something important. Laws do not emerge from a vacuum. They're usually the final hard shell around practices already tested in life. By 1630, colonists are already experimenting with the ideas that will mature into harsher legal systems. They are learning what profits them, what comforts them, and what arguments they need to justify it. Law will later formalize much of this, but society is already rehearsing the role. The household is one place where this hardening becomes visible. Masters and mistresses increasingly treat black labour as a stable asset rather than a temporary service. That shift changes everything: food, clothing, punishment, sleeping arrangements, work expectations. Even the language used around a person all begin to reflect deeper assumptions of possession. A worker is no longer merely someone serving time. A worker becomes part of the estate's imagined continuity. That is not security. It is entrapment made more deliberate. Children reveal the system's future most clearly. In a colony moving toward racial slavery, children are taught distinctions before they can explain them. They watch who sits where, who eats what, who may speak first, who receives punishment, who is addressed with respect, who is monitored, who is trusted, who is feared. White children learn superiority as a social habit. Black children learn vulnerability as an environmental fact. Once those lessons settle into daily reflex, the colony no longer relies only on rules from above. It begins reproducing hierarchy through instinct. One strange and revealing detail of colonial culture is how often people congratulate themselves on building civilization while arranging it around coercion. They write letters about order, property, and godliness. They speak of planting society in a wilderness. They admire their own seriousness. Meanwhile, the society they're planting depends more and more on turning human beings into inheritable labour. There is something painfully absurd in that self-image. A man may look over muddy fields worked by people denied freedom and sincerely believe he is a guardian of moral improvement. Colonial self-regard is not modest. The courts and assemblies will eventually give stronger shape to these assumptions. Questions about baptism, interracial unions, inheritance, status, and maternal descent will be answered in increasingly racialized ways. Scholars still debate whether the change was driven most strongly by economic calculation, elite fear of labour instability, cultural prejudice, or legal borrowing from other Atlantic systems. The wisest answer is likely some combination. Human cruelty tends to be annoyingly collaborative. Profit, fear, vanity, and inherited prejudice rarely work alone when they can work together. For Black Americans living in this early period, the hardening system means narrowing possibilities. A few individuals may still gain freedom, acquire land, or carve out unusual positions. Those lives matter. They prove the future was not mathematically inevitable in each small detail. But the broader direction is grim. The colony is becoming less willing to see black labour as temporary. and more eager to tie status to colour across generations. A person's daily life is shaped by this even before every rule is written down. Opportunity feels thinner, promises feel less trustworthy, ownership feels more confident in its own voice. The physical world reflects the change too. More land is cleared, more tobacco moves through drying houses and onto ships. More storehouses rise near river landings. More fences mark private claim. The smell of cured leaf, tar, mud, and livestock becomes the scent of expanding wealth. Yet that wealth does not float freely in the air. It has weight, and much of that weight falls on black bodies. Every barrel packed for market, every field widened, every house improved by labour carries the mark of a system becoming more efficient at hiding violence inside routine. There is also a shift in emotion among colonists. Early fragility does not disappear, but some settlers begin to feel more secure in their command. The colony survives, profits improve, families establish themselves, authority grows less apologetic. When domination starts to feel normal, it becomes easier to intensify. People who once justified a harsh measure as temporary now present it as practical. What was once excused as necessity becomes defended as order. This is how societies teach themselves not to blush. Black communities, scattered and pressured though they may be, feel this tightening immediately. Kinship becomes more vulnerable. Mobility grows more restricted. Labour expectations deepen. Punishments become more clearly tied to preserving a racial order, not merely correcting individual behaviour. Yet black life does not disappear into the system's design. It continues in family bonds, in naming, in work skill, in memory, in prayer, in small refusals, in laughter that slips through despite everything. The system hardens, yes, but it never gains perfect control over the people trapped within it. That imperfection is morally important, even when it brings no immediate rescue. You can also sense the wider Atlantic world pressing on the colony. English North America does not invent racial slavery alone in splendid isolation. It learns from Caribbean plantations, from Iberian precedents, from maritime trade networks, from merchants who compare notes across oceans, and from officials willing to borrow profitable ideas. The Atlantic is not just water, it is a corridor of information, methods, and excuses, techniques of buying, transporting, disciplining, and classifying people move through that corridor along with barrels, letters, and rumours. By 1630, the colony is already part of this larger education in organised inhumanity, and yet the system's future success is not guaranteed by logic alone. It depends on thousands of ordinary choices. A magistrate rules one way instead of another. A minister decides which scripture to emphasise. A planter chooses lifelong service over limited-term labour. A clerk records a child's status in a particular manner. A parent teaches prejudice at the dinner table. A merchant invests in another voyage. History often feels gigantic in hindsight, but while it is being made, it passes through hands, rooms, voices, and paperwork. That makes it more chilling, not less. The great structure of American slavery is built from countless local acts of agreement. Even the landscape seems enlisted. Rivers become commercial arteries. Forest clearings become labour sites. Marsh edges become boundaries. Roads become channels through which tobacco, tools, gossip, and law all travel together. Dawn mist rises over land that is being transformed by ownership and toil. Evening settles over cabins where exhaustion lies down before hope does. The air smells of ash, damp leaves, sweat, and leaf cure. Nature remains beautiful in flashes, but the human order placed upon it grows steadily harsher. For black Americans, the early hardening of the system means living inside a future not yet fully declared but already approaching. You can feel it in how people look at you, in how they count your labour, in how they discuss children, in how religion is offered without equality, in how promises become slippery, in how punishment seeks not simply obedience but permanence. The colony is practicing a new idea of society, one in which blackness itself becomes tied to bondage more securely with each passing year. That process will shape centuries, quietly at first, then brutally plainly. As night comes on, the settlement settles into its usual sounds. Frogs call from wet ground. Wind brushes the walls. Coals pulse red in the hearth. Somewhere a baby stirs. Somewhere someone coughs in the dark. The ordinary life of the colony continues, but beneath it the larger structure is tightening. What began as uncertainty has not vanished. It has been organized. That is the deeper menace. Disorder can be survived day by day. System gives disorder a memory and a future. So what does it mean that the system hardens? It means the early colony is moving from improvisation toward intention. It means that black labour is being claimed with greater confidence, black family life with less protection, black childhood with darker assumptions, and black humanity with narrower acknowledgement. It means profit, race, law, and religion are learning to cooperate in a way that will scar the continent for generations. The early days are not a separate innocent era before slavery becomes real. They are the workshop in which reality is being assembled. Now the night can soften. The sounds around you begin to thin. Voices fade behind rough wooden walls. The last movements of the day grow gentler, smaller, more distant. Smoke lifts in a slow ribbon through the dark rafters, and the scent of ash settles into cloth, hair, and tired skin. Outside, the river moves almost silently under the moon, carrying its pale light across black water. Pine branches sway with a faint hush. In the marsh, insects keep their steady rhythm, patient and unhurried, as if the earth itself has decided to breathe more slowly. You let the colony drift into shadow. The fields are quiet now. The tools are set down. The door latches have stopped clicking. Bare feet and worn shoes no longer cross the yard. Even the dogs seem less interested in the business of the world. The night air cools the day's heat from the ground, and the smell of damp grass rises clean and soft. Somewhere close by, a child sleeps at last. Somewhere else, an elder closes tired eyes. The hard edges of command blur for a little while in darkness. History remains what it is, heavy, human, often cruel. But in this late hour, you do not need to carry every weight at once. You can simply rest beside the knowledge that people lived, endured, remembered, and held on to one another even in difficult worlds. You can leave the ledgers, the arguments, the laws, and the labour to the night breeze now. Let them thin out like smoke above the coals. The sky stretches wide over riverbank and clearing, over cabins and fields, over sleeping birds tucked into reeds, over every soul beneath it. The stars do not explain anything. They only shine quietly, and that quiet is enough. So breathe slowly. Let the darkness feel kind. Let the story grow still. End of script. Sleep well.